I am so excited to spend this time with you to kind of unpack the relationship between the music director and the composer, especially in the generation of new work. And I suspect that one of the very first questions that any composer is going to have for you is, how do I get my music in front of you? How do I get my music performed or commissioned by an orchestra? So I'm curious if you can share a bit about the music director's role in the process and if there are any other people within the orchestral context that composers should know.
That's a great question, because that's sort of the name of the game for composers, is trying to find ways of getting their pieces performed. And the fact of the matter is that there are many points of entry. One could say there are many gatekeepers in the field that have that control and that ability to make an opportunity happen. I think the first things first, of course, every composer needs to build a network. They need to create relationships. They need to create friends, ultimately. A lot of the composers that I commission and that I champion are people that I have become close with in some kind of way, because their work reflects themselves as people and reflects what they believe in. And oftentimes that's something that I either admire, I am inspired by, or that I believe in myself. And so it's important for me that I have that relationship with a composer in some kind of way. There are other times when I just find something on the internet or somebody recommends something to me and I'm like, that's a great piece, I want to do that at some point. That happens all the time as well. But ultimately, it's all those little points of entry that everybody kind of has for themselves. Me as a performer, as a conductor, I try to widen my network. So I have people that, will have my ear and will recommend things to me. Composers themselves also, casting their network very, very wide so they can really create those relationships with a lot of people. I mean, that's just the most important thing.
Yeah, that's amazing. So I love that you are focusing on the relationship as the primary entry point. I suspect you probably get a lot of scores that come to you. How many of those actually get looked at?
Unfortunately, I think I can pretty much speak to it and make a generic statement that unsolicited doesn't quite work as well. For me, I don't have time. I get a lot of wonderful pieces. I get a lot of pieces unsolicited. My team in Phoenix at the Phoenix Symphony gets a lot of that as well. And we just unfortunately don't have the resources or the time to be able to look at all of that. So the more that I get somebody else to tell me, no, that one you need to listen to, that's always helpful, because then I can narrow things down. It's just very, very hard because, there's only so many hours in the day.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And, to me, the way that we worked together was through Earshot. So through that program, ACO very much is that matchmaker, which is one of my favorite things to do.
Right.
And, I'm also curious, as you're thinking about the idea of the composer having a point of view, you said that's sort of what you're looking for. I think a lot of artists struggle with how much of themselves to bring to their music and also how much of themselves to show to you in the brief moments that they might have together with you. And I'm curious if you have any advice along those lines.
Yeah, I think for composers and for performers, it's the same thing. I think we all struggle with that in the arts in general. I personally believe that, and this is just me, I believe that, you have to have something to say, and you have to be willing to put yourself out there and say it. Is it going to be everybody's cup of tea? No, of course not. But look at any major composer, and they've had people who like their music, they've had people who didn't like their music. That's just how things go. I think in the end, if you put yourself out there and are really true to who you are, and you have really something substantive and something interesting to say, you'll find your fan base. You'll find those people that agree with you or that are inspired by you, and they will come to you. And ultimately, that's sort of the way I feel. Then you can be your genuine self. Then you can put out something that really makes a statement. And even if others don't necessarily have the same viewpoint or the same whatever, there is a certain amount of respect that people have for people who come out and put themselves on paper, put themselves in a piece. I think that's super important. It inspires me. It gives me a purpose for presenting a work. When I present new work in Phoenix, I always try to have the composer come out and speak to the audience and introduce themselves so the audience gets to know why. What am I hearing and why did they write this?
I love that word that you use, genuine, like that idea of being genuine. And I think a lot of people come into these conversations feeling they need to be who the other person expects them to be.
Right.
And that's such beautiful advice. Last thing that I'll maybe ask before we switch gears a little bit, is there anybody else within the orchestra that you feel composers should be building relationships with? So we've talked about the music director or perhaps people who have the ear of the music director who might be able to recommend. Right. I'm curious if there are any others.
The more wider net you cast, the better, because in the end, we certainly have musicians on our artistic advisory committees. I mean, I think every orchestra has something like that. And so musicians themselves from the orchestras are going to be the ones that are going to recommend new works and new artists and new things. Most orchestras have some equivalent of an artistic administrator. That's that muse that's in the orchestra administration that helps the music director program the season. Generally, that's my right-hand person. That's the person that has a lay of the land of the industry, because I don't know everything. Nobody knows who everybody's out there. And this person can usually help and usually kind of bring me things. They usually know what I'm interested in or what I like. They can say, hey, I just heard this, or I just heard about this, or somebody recommended this to me. So there's so many entry points. I mean, but I think musicians themselves, administrators in the orchestra that are maybe upper management that definitely have the ear of the conductor, other conductors, because we certainly talk to each other. You know, I have a lot of conductor colleagues that I speak to and that give me a lot of recommendations. So I really think that everybody, the more you can connect with everybody, the better.
Yeah, that's such a great piece of advice. And I've also heard librarians can be an often forgotten source of
100%.
referrals
Yeah.
For new pieces. So speaking of Phoenix, you had a project in Phoenix that's such a great example of how a music director can identify, develop, and advocate for a work throughout its development. And I'm really curious to hear more about one particular project that I know is top of mind for you.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this earlier, but this is a very, very dear friend of mine. His name is Earl Manian. He's actually a violinist. We actually went to school together. But he started dabbling in composition. His I think, main love, musical inspiration is heavy metal music, actually. That's where he's a trained violinist, but his other kind of side is heavy metal, and really, really very much into that. He started dabbling in composition, arranging some songs, arranging his own songs to string quartet, to acoustic instruments and things like that. And he made a connection with the violinist Rachel Barton Pine, the very well-known violin soloist, because she's also a metalhead. She also loves heavy metal music. She found him. She knew who he was. She sent him a text. She said, hey, I need a piece, a unaccompanied violin piece, like a thing. And he developed a relationship with her that way. He wrote the piece for her. And at some point, I remember hearing the piece, and I thought, man, this is really, really great. Like, you're really, like, developing as a composer. I mean, this is a real, like, structured, wonderful thing. Let's get an orchestra piece. And that eventually turned into a violin concerto that Rachel agreed to play with the Phoenix Symphony. I said, look, let's do it. I know you've never written an orchestra piece before, but let's put it on the table. I'll give you 2 years to do it, and let's see what happens. You know, why not? And as part of that, I knew that I had an opportunity to pull together some resources to make this as successful as possible. And one of the things that was really important to me was doing a workshop of the piece, making sure that Earl had a chance to hear, the opportunity to hear what he wrote, because he's never done orchestra before. This would have been his first time. So we connected with Arizona State University, which I have a relationship with in Phoenix, in Tempe. And they were the first ones to read through the concerto with Rachel. And Rachel flew out for this. So it was an amazing opportunity for the students, for the school itself. Some of the faculty at the school also was there to give support. Earl knows some of the people there. And Earl was able to hear his piece for the very first time in that guise. So he was able to make corrections, make changes, make recommendations. And then eventually we did the premiere later on in Phoenix, which was a pretty amazing success. We've recorded it since with another orchestra. And so it's been that was a really kind of amazing sort of trajectory for a piece, because it was over 2-3 years. He wrote the piece, we had the workshop for it, and then eventually seeing it to come to fruition through all the resources that we had and we could pull ultimately it's about passion for a piece, passion for a composer, and believing in somebody enough that you want to put all of those resources into it.
That's amazing. I want to take a minute and just process-wise unpack some of the main things that you just said, because really the point of this is for us to all understand how we can create work like this on our own, and what were some of the main points where you had questions that you were asking and answering, or places where you were exercising the various, resources at your disposal. So first and foremost, it sounds like these are both artists that you had relationships with to begin with.
Right. I mean, Rachel, I actually didn't know until she met Earl.
Oh, wow.
So we all met through this project, actually. Or, I mean, I've known Earl for a long time, but I met Rachel through this project, and Earl essentially met Rachel through this relationship that he built with her. Because, again, he was genuine with his he wasn't thinking about whether or not heavy metal crossover into classical was a thing. He just wrote what he felt like writing, and it spoke to somebody, and that's how this thing came to be. So we all were able to get together because of this project, and then it was all just a matter of sitting at the table and saying, okay, how are we going to make this work? What do we have? What can we do? Rachel, can you come out at this week? Yes, I'd love to come out and work with the students. She did a master class for the students. It became an actual thing. Then, of course, once we had ASU at the table, then they were like, okay, what can we do in this weekend to make this a really kind of a big deal for us and big deal for everybody? It was just a win-win for every single stakeholder in this whole project.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds like from that first relationship, you were able to figure out how this serves both of the artists involved, and then to be really thinking broadly about who could be involved as a partner in the creation of that. And I just want to underline here that this is something that is really imaginative on your part, and maybe goes a little bit beyond what a typical commissioning process would look like, where perhaps you might be commissioning a work from a composer who has written several orchestral pieces before, and they just deliver the work to you. Right. It gets rehearsed. So in this case, it feels like you were taking a little bit of a risk. Like, to
a certain extent, I think being able to do the workshop mitigated the risk in a lot of ways, obviously, But it's an interesting thing, because orchestras are expensive. And ultimately, a lot of the times, we can always say, it's too expensive to do X, Y, and Z. And frankly, yes. I mean, in Phoenix, to commission something. I mean, I commissioned Earl myself. This wasn't the orchestra doing it, because he's a friend. He's somebody that I believe in, and all of that. The Phoenix Symphony at the time was not in a position to be able to commission a full piece like that. It's quite expensive. But ultimately, if you have a vision for wanting to bring a work of art to life, then I think it's also, aside, of course, speaking with the composers and them doing as much as they can to make those connections, but it's also up to the performers to really take on that responsibility to find a way to make it happen. There's always a way. There's always a resource. There's always connections in the community you can make. There are always people that you can work together with, that you can create really interesting experiences and really interesting art. Ultimately, that's why we do what we do. And so, when it came down to this, I was able to take care of the piece itself, but I wanted to make it successful. So of course, if I had the relationship with Arizona State, I knew that was not going to be that was going to be a no-brainer for them, no-brainer for us, and it always, when it comes from a genuine place of wanting to create something substantive and meaningful, people will back it. People will, come to it. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened with ASU. And then, of course, with our orchestra, they embraced it. Once it came to them, it was a more polished product. It was something that they didn't have any issues. They could play it, and it was a really exciting piece. A heavy metal, inspired violin concerto, which has never really been done before in that kind of way, prompted a whole lot of media attention. The local paper wrote about it, and then eventually we were really able to get it recorded on a CD that came out last year. So it's all about just believing in something and just finding a way to do it.
Absolutely, and it sounds like all of you were very lucky to have one another in this process.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. It was really fortuitous. A really fortuitous kind of group of people. But a lot of sometimes there are a lot of commissions that's how it goes. When the performers are all and the artists are all kind of on the same wavelength, because that's what it is. In the end, it's you can say, okay, I'm writing a piece, that's it. But if you're really creating something as a collaboration in a lot of ways, then a little bit of everybody is in that piece, is in that performance, is in that, so to be able to then take it to another orchestra and record it, it was kind of it was very easy, actually, when we finally went there, because we only had 3 sessions to record it and with a different group. And so that was, we knew it. We knew it cold. We knew what we wanted to do. We knew what it wanted to sound like. And it worked. But again, that's the relationship building. That's the only way it kind of works.
Yeah, and I love that you use the word collaboration, ultimately, because a commission is, first of all, an opportunity to create something that doesn't exist, but in its best form, it is a collaboration between the artist and the composer, perhaps even including the public or other folks in the process. And, I have to imagine that for the ASU musicians, who, by the way, congratulations for choosing a great partner. It's a very adventurous place, so I imagine that was a great experience. I imagine for them, seeing that process in real time was really informative and inspiring.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that goes also with almost any kind of new music reading that happens. I think the orchestra is an important part of that, because, and I also think that it's also up to whoever's sort of leading those sessions, those kinds of sessions, whether it's a workshop, whether it's an earshot reading session, whatever the case may be, to set a tone for the working aspect of this. That it's these aren't always finished pieces. These are still pieces that are still being worked out, and to set a tone so that everybody's really in that collaborative mode. Like, okay, maybe this doesn't work for my instrument. Let's see if we can figure it out. If the composer's figuring it out, we're figuring it out. And that can be difficult sometimes, because if it's, if the personalities are not quite gelling, and it's because it's, again, about relationships. It's about how you set a tone for the working process. And I think that's so important from everybody, from the composer, from the musicians themselves, from the conductor, especially the conductor, because the conductor is the one that's kind of usually managing the whole thing and making sure that that's the environment that you want to set for the whole process.
Yeah, and I love the idea of setting a tone, right? Because this is a piece that in its inception involved a little bit of risk. And so to get artists to be comfortable taking risks and having those be imperfect in a workshop is such an important thing, because at that point we feel comfortable being able to learn from one another.
Yeah.
And I also suspect that in many situations, composers walk into orchestra rehearsals, and it functionally feels like the point of that is for the composer to, for lack of a better way to say it, learn how to write for the orchestra, right? And so it feels like the process you've laid out here is where, the learning goes in all directions, especially on a piece where the musical style that the composer is bringing with them might be something that was a little different from the training of the musicians on the stage.
100%. I mean, I think that's where I think the orchestra industry differs a lot from a lot of other performing arts, because a lot of other performing arts, they build in time to play. They build in time to experiment. They build in time to create. And not just create alone at the desk, to create like in the space with the performers, and we don't do that. We don't do that enough. And I think that's the change of mindset that people have to have when they're in these situations. Like, this is a moment where we're not efficiency, okay, yes, because we have a time limit. Yes, of course, all of that's fine. But we do have to be able to just like let go a little bit and experiment and try things and play a little bit. And it's okay if it's not like concert ready right now. I've done a few composer readings, and I did a recent earshot with you guys. And I wonder, those are really great because you get a chance to hear it. I mean, the one that I did, we did 2 readings of. We were able to do a reading, a working reading, fix some things. I think the composer got a lot of really great feedback, which I think is amazing, from the musicians themselves as well. And then they came back and they had some time implemented. I mean, that's also, we're also dealing with efficiency. We're dealing with like time constraints. We're dealing with all sorts of things. But I wonder if for ACO, because the orchestra itself is devoted to this kind of thing. It's devoted to new work, devoted to the creation of new work. I wonder if, what else during a period of an earshot that you found has been really, really beneficial to composers, aside from just the working with the orchestra?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I mean, earshot now encompasses all of our composer advancement work. So what you experienced was the readings, where there is a very defined time frame, and composers who apply to participate are sending us finished scores. So by definition, they've already decided, I want to write for orchestra, and they've put the notes on paper in order for that to be the case. One of the things that I think about is that we're not going to find all of the composers, artists, creators that we would love to be making the orchestral music of the future that way, because not every artist has made the decision in advance of participating with us that they have an orchestral score ready to go. So we started bringing back a program that ACO did probably around 2012, a little earlier around that time frame, called Collaboratory, which is more of a residency process. And that's why I was so excited by hearing about the workshopping aspect of what you were doing in Phoenix, because it's very near and dear to our heart to be thinking about the idea that in that particular instance, we're asking composers not to submit a score, but to submit an idea. And an idea that we hope will expand the very definition of American orchestral music, and that has enough meat to it where a process of inquiry is kind of required and necessary for that piece to come to life in the way that the artist is envisioning it. So that could be anything from indigenous music making practices, improvisation, graphic score, electronic music, instruments that don't yet exist. There are many different things that can happen there. But to me, what's really beautiful about it is that there are multiple touch points over the course of that year. There is resource provided in the form of both funding the commission, but also supporting musician groups in increasing size over the course of that process, and also any other collaborators or support that the artist might need in order to realize their vision. So whether that's an expert in music technology or somebody else who is a co-collaborator on the project, just really making sure the right people are around that project to see it through. And the other thing that I would say is, for me, the beauty is in coming into any of those workshops with a question that you're looking to explore. Very seldom is there an actual finished score in that process. Usually in the early stages, it's going to be a sketch. It's going to be a series of cells. It's going to be an A/B test. It's going to be a max patch that needs to be tested with a section of violinists. It's going to be any one of a number of things that are helpful to be asked and answered before a score is created. And it also leads in some very, very interesting directions. So to me, that's where some of the most adventurous music is getting made, by definition of the idea that the score didn't exist when we first came in the picture.
I mean, I think that's like one of the, for me, that's where we were just talking about this idea that, when we're always focused, especially in orchestra, we're always focused on, we got to get it done, efficiency. It's always like there has to be a finished product by the end of whatever we just invested in. And that's not always the case. It's not always conducive for the creation of something. That's not always conducive for anybody to feel comfortable and good about what they're putting out. And I think that that's something that we don't feel enough of. I mean, I've been to many other places, many other countries even that fund the artistic process, that are a little bit more, I think, maybe open-minded to the idea that, no, we might not get a finished product by the end of this. It's okay, because that's just, we believe in this person. We believe that this idea is worthwhile, and we want to see where this person can take it to, or where this group of people or this collaboration could lead us to something that maybe somebody else can pick up the mantle and go from there. And I think that that's something that I love about the idea behind this. I think that it's great working with ACO in this kind of way, because that's I feel like more orchestras definitely need to pick up that mantle and take that responsibility of helping create, because who else is going to do it, frankly?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And one of the things that I most love about ACO is that we're not just doing that work with our own orchestra. We're in partnership with orchestras across the country every year. And I'm seeing that increasingly more and more orchestras are asking to be a part of collaboratory residencies, even as opposed to the readings, because that open space is something that's a little bit separate and apart from the way they typically will generate work. And they're looking for both some help getting the right people into the right spaces, and also a structure around how to make that process as successful as it can be. So to me, that's a really good sign that things are headed in the right direction, and it also is resulting in some really beautiful projects.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I've seen. So I'm very, very grateful to be a small part of realizing some of these projects with ACO, but it's been really, really great seeing that come to fruition.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the other thing that I would say here is that it very much is a co-learning situation. Every artist who comes into the room, they're bringing a perspective, they're bringing an expertise. Sometimes that expertise was not trained in a conservatory. And it's amazing to see that process happen in a room with musicians, no matter what their training may happen to be. So if set up properly, everybody wins in that scenario. Everybody comes out richer. picture, but I think an underlying principle throughout this conversation has been one of risk. You know, we're trained as orchestra musicians, and I'm saying this as a recovering piccolo player. You know, risk is not something that you're really excited about when you're in an orchestra setting, because there's so much pressure on you. The lights are on. You've got one chance to do it right. You know, and it's really great to be in an environment at that stage of your career in an orchestral context where play is the point, where experimentation is okay, where messing something up and finding another solution is actually the primary goal.
Yeah,
so,
risk is in the eye of the beholder, actually, in the end, because, I mean, I think classical music seems to be, you know, and I'm saying this with a lot of respect for what we do, but classical music seems to be the only genre where this idea is just not part of the natural language, this idea that you can collaborate with different genres or different musicians and just make something and just see what happens. You know, it's just not something that we tend to look positively on, or at least in historically we haven't, or it's a lot of fear because it's not part of our training either. You know, we're kind of stuck in a box in some ways, and so I think the more we get opportunities like this, the more opportunities we get through earshot and programs like that, the better. And so I'm optimistic for the future.
As am I.
Good.